بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Yahya al-Banna from International Islamic University, Malaysia. Inshallah, today I will present my paper, which is the objectivity of Al Jazeera and BBC media coverage of women and children during the Israeli-Palestinian conflict of May 2021. My supervisor is Dr. Noor Baidouri Raslan. The introduction. The essential function of mass media is to broadcast news and information on events around the world. Mass media such as newspaper, radio and television and news websites are significant information sources that audience depends on to understand what is happening in their surroundings. For example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of critical issues in the world, which received wide attention from the mass media and public locally and globally. International networks such as Al Jazeera and BBC have a considerable interest in issues and events related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They inform the audience of information and news from this area. So to cover this area, they have correspondents and media offices in the Palestine to spread and publish all the news quickly during any conflict. When we speak about news coverage, of course, we speak about the objectivity. So one of the fundamental principles of journalism is to aim for objectivity when reporting on events. As a result, journalists must make it a top priority, and when it comes to reporting the news, journalists must be objective and fair, which requires the presentation of the event in the news report. Therefore, if the press had objectivity, which is identified by balance and impartiality, neutral presentation in the news, and also it will be able to convey both sides of the story objectively. So as we seen here in the slide, Israel launched a war in Gaza Strip in 2021 that lasted 2 weeks, and the women and the children are civilians that have become victims of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thus, it is essential to study how media frame them and also how portray them in their reality in news or in coverage. Thus, this study will examine the news coverage of women and children by Al Jazeera and BBC during the Israeli-Palestinian conflict of May 2021. Also, the study will analyze the frequency with which the two major news networks covered women and children. And the second slide for the statement of the problem. The statement of the problem, there are 3 reasons for this study as the gap. The first one, objectivity of reporting. Several studies have criticized the media coverage of Israeli conflict with the Palestinians as unfair and biased by al-Kayali in 2017, al-Sarraj and Lubad 2018, Rizova and Bana Yutova in 2021, media agenda of children and women during Israel-Palestinian conflict, so that all the coverage attention and frequently about issues like political issue and economic and political stance of the event, but they give a little attention to issue of children and women during the events, and also a lack of studies. The literature also showed that researchers mostly focus on examining general issue, but if your researchers examine the children and women, whether on the media coverage of local or international media. So in this study, It's like attempts to address this gap, which is represented by disparity in news coverage in international media when it comes to reporting on women and children. Furthermore, there were only a handful of studies that investigated these civilian groups. Hence, the purpose of this study is to fill the gap by examining the practice of objectivity reporting and the differences between Al Jazeera and BBC in their news coverage and content about children and women in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in May. So in the significance of the study, firstly, it will be contribute to the global media studies on the news coverage by Al Jazeera and BBC. And also this proposed study hopes to systematically study the variables identified to add toward the literature and content analysis of news framing of women and children during the war and the objectivity of news reporting in such coverage. Secondly, the study will add empirical findings to increase an increased body of literature about the news coverage of Al Jazeera and BBC respectively. Third, the study is considered as one the recent studies that will examine the current media agenda and representation of both networks coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 2021 with the focus on women and children during the war that listed fortnightly. In the research objective, the main objective of this study is to examine the coverage of women and children in the recent Israel-Palestinian conflict of May 2021 by Al Jazeera and BBC. How objective is the news networks in reporting about women and children? The specifically objectives are to analyze the frequency of the media coverage on women and children by Al Jazeera and BBC in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, by analyzing the frequency news reporting about women and children, and also to analyze the frequency of images about women and children in the news coverage of Al Jazeera and BBC. The second, to investigate the objectivity of Al Jazeera and BBC in their news coverage of women and children in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict of May, and the objectivity include the three specific objective to examine the type of framing and to find out whether Al Jazeera and BBC use diversity of sources, and to examine the direction of news reporting used by Al Jazeera and BBC in their coverage of women and children. And the third one, to examine whether there is a significant differences between Al Jazeera and BBC in their frequency of coverage and the news reporting objectivity of women and children. A researcher review in the objectivity of news coverage. The researchers who have conducted studies on media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Western and Eastern media to examine the questions regarding balance and bias have arrived at very different conclusion. Many of them have found the Western media give attention to the Israeli side more than of the Palestinian side. Also in the news sources, the literature on news coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has indicated the Western media are more interested in the Israeli sources than Palestinian sources. And the slide direction of news in this study, or many studies have examined the news content, the direction of news, measure the balance of news coverage by using 3-point scales to measure news direction as negative, positive, and neutral, and framing the Palestinian-Israel conflict. The literature showed that the Western media focus on war and Al Jazeera, and the local Palestinian media focus on a human interest frame. The media representation of children and women during the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. According to those studies as al-Aqtash and Saif and Ruziva and al-Banna Yotova and al-Agha, The local Palestinian media focus on important issues such as children's rights, education, and physically affected of the conflict on children. And then if you examine the news coverage of Palestinian children during the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, some of these studies showed the culture and agenda differences in media coverage of Palestinian children between international and local media. The media representation of women, also the literature gap, reflected the lack of studies that have addressed media coverage of women and children during the Israeli-Palestinian theoretical framework, agenda setting theory. The media primary function in the agenda setting theory is to focus on the public attention on the few significant topics and issue and repeat this issue in the media. So this paper used agenda setting and framing at the second level to determine the extent which women and children are covered, and also the paper attempts to test two new news frame, women rights frame and child rights frame, beside the conflict frame and responsibility frame and morality frame by adopt Sumetico and Fellingenberg in 2000. And the second about the hypothesis. Beside on the literature review, the following hypotheses are proposed. Hypothesis 1, Al Jazeera covered women and children more frequently than BBC during the Israeli-Palestinian conflict of May 2021. And the hypothesis 2, Al Jazeera is more objective than the BBC in coverage of women and children during the Israeli-Palestinian conflict of May in 2021. The methodology. In this study, the researcher will use a quantitative content analysis method, and for the sampling selection as representative sampling, 169 of the news stories were chosen using the purposive sampling procedure, of which the main criterion for the sampling is the news stories covered about women and children. And the primary unit of analysis are the news report and breaking news. And also the study used holistic reliability test to determine intercoder reliability. In the pilot study, the researcher tested the coding sheet and coding protocol by selecting 40 news reports from Al Jazeera and BBC from May 25 to July 8. It's like after the period of actual study. The overall intercoder agreement for all the items of the study is 0.89. For data collection, the researcher has taken a sample of retaining news, of which 169 were collected. 81 of them were from BBC and 115 from Al Jazeera. In data analysis, the study will use the chi-square non-parametric analysis and descriptive statistics and frequencies percentage. That's all. Thank you so much for listening to me in my presentation.